This screencast will be presenting on basic searching and information seeking skills for coding related activities. I originally presented this as part of a Python workshop that I ran in fall of 2014, but I wanted to create a screencast about it because I haven't really seen any other material cover these sort of topics. If you do know about one, I would love to have a link to it, so feel free to comment that in. I was inspired to create this talk by a paper that I've linked to at the end, where they observed the searching behaviors and strategies of novice programmers within a UX lab. It's a fascinating paper to read for anyone who teaches basic programming skills, but even for newbies as well, to see that you're not alone in a lot of the challenges that you will face. I recreated some of the similar problems within Python, but what I'll be talking about today should be relatively language agnostic. How you form a search in Google, for example, makes a huge difference in the quality of the result that you get back. So we know this fact from just living in the 21st century. But how can we make this searching better in the context of programming, particularly when you're very, very new to it? So when I say know your content, I really mean focus on the vocabulary that you're using. Every community has this sort of canonical vocabulary of items. Practice being able to describe code in your own natural language that meets the canonical standards of that community. For example, Python calls things lists. Other languages might call things arrays. There are some technical differences in there, but if you're looking for answers about lists while using the word array in the context of Python, you're going to get some weird Google search results coming up. Also, seek feedback. As you're practicing this language with someone you know who is more experienced, ask for feedback. Ask, did I use that word correctly? And accept this feedback graciously because they're trying to be helpful. So when you do a Google search for something, or any other search engine, try to first search with natural language. For example, use a statement like, how do I find the last element of a list? So not only are you using the correct vocabulary, but you're also using words that are going to hit on the actual answers. For example, if you just try to search for the code or like how to do a list in Python, you're going to have to do a lot of searching through that, a lot of filtering of different results. Also, like the same function or the same statement can be used in many different types of answers. So focus on using this natural language. And again, as I said previously, practice that language and seek out feedback about it as well. So search for the minimum single action element of your line of code. So you have a long line of code. It starts with an assignment statement, goes into a function handling a bunch of data coming into it. If something's going wrong in there, it's probably something to do with that function itself. Of course, once you've ruled out the data part of it, but that's something else to keep in mind. But in order for you to know how does that function work, you should look for just that function. Don't include any local variables, don't include any extraneous information. If you're looking up how that function works, just look up for the documentation or another resource on just that specific function. So the second part is know your sources. Every documentation source speaks to something specific. Know what you're searching for and what that documentation piece is speaking to as well. So essential questions to ask about any source. So what's the domain or tool this is written for? Is this written for Python in general, or is this written for just general text activities? Is this a reference or a guidance book? So is this something for me to look up how certain functions work, or how the basic syntax works in the language? Or is this a guidance thing meant to take me from beginning to end of learning how to do a specific task? So is it like a dictionary, or is it a style guide or a style manual that's going to have some prose involved in it? Also, know if this source has helped you in the past. So if you have read a blog or seen a tutorial website, such as something like learn Python the hard way, if you know that has helped you in the past, go seek that out first, or preface that over others. Finally, know where the information is coming from. Is this something that was written by someone who is really involved in the Python community or whatever community that you're working in, or was it written by, let's say, a high schooler? You just put up a blog post about something, or even know how to interpret the context of Stack Overflow exchanges and posts. So let's work through an example here about how to assess a problem. So let's take this code snippet. So you have import random starting at the top. You have nums being assigned the value, a list that will yield 10 elements going from 0 to 9. Rando nums is being assigned this random.shuffle being passed nums. So when we print nums, we see nums itself has been shuffled. And then when we try to print rando nums, the value is coming in as none. So what went wrong? This is a really classic example of a semantic error where everything you've written is technically correct. Like Python has absolutely no problem executing what you've done, but what you've done is not what you actually intended to do. And that's what we call a semantic error versus a syntactical error. So let's unpack what happened here a little bit. So again, we see that this list, the original list that we tried to keep protected in its own thing, because again, we tried to create a new variable to contain the shuffled one. But the original itself has been shuffled. So that was unexpectedly changed. And then this none, the random nums, is unexpectedly empty. So in this case, where is our main action happening? So in all of these lines, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different lines of code. Where is the main action occurring? This line with the random.shuffle is the line where that main action point is happening. So let's unpack this line a little bit more. So again, we have rando nums equals random.shuffle passing in nums. So if this is our action sentence, where's the verb of this sentence? It's right here in random.shuffle. This is the function that we're calling. So we're calling the shuffle function within the random module. So we know the problem has to do with this random.shuffle. But what's the question? So to start off with, why did it shuffle nums? That's a totally valid question. Why is random nums empty? Also a very valid question. Finally, how does random.shuffle work? So of these three questions, which of these questions do you think was going to give us the best search results? So this one, it's not awesome because what does the internet know about my local variable called nums? Generally nothing. Let's try to form a search query about this of like, why did Python shuffle my list? Well, that's not going to yield a whole lot of really great results. So second, why is random nums empty? And you might get an interesting result of like Googling why is my variable have the value of none. That could maybe have some intriguing answers. But this last one I think is the best. How does random.shuffle work? So we know that random.shuffle is doing something to within our code, and it's doing something unexpected. That means we need to take a time to review what is actually happening inside of random.shuffle. So we have our question now. Now we need to assess what kind of question it is. Is this a reference or is this a guidance question? And there are absolutely arguments for both sides, but I would take the stance that this is a reference question. It is a question that begins with the word how. How does this function work? Not why does this function work, which would be a prose answer, but how does this function work? That's telling me that I'm looking for the documentation. So very generally speaking, when you have a reference question, you're usually going to answer it with the documentation. So if you need to find a function within the docs, Google it is often the easiest way to find where it appears. And so you'll note here that I searched for just random.shuffle. I didn't search for any question. I didn't include my nums variable name. Just purely the function name is going to get you the fastest way to get you to the official documentation. Now let's take a look at the first result here. So that I can tell from the URL here that it's coming in from docs.python.org, which I know is the official documentation for Python. I can see that it's coming in for Python 2, and then the page itself is talking about the random library. So this seems like a pretty great place to start. Yay! So the solution. So this is the entry. I've gone in and I've searched, so I clicked on that page, and I've searched for random.shuffle in here. Now, if you did from random import shuffle, you're not in your code, you're just going to have shuffle. You're not going to have random.shuffle. But that's sort of a nuance to Python. If you just search for the word shuffle in here, you're still going to get this. It's just not going to be as direct. I know to search for the dot notation because I'm familiar with the documentation for Python itself. Every language is going to be a little bit different. So this is the formal entry within the documentation about random.shuffle. Let's take a look at what's going on here. So this first statement, the first sentence is often the most important statement that you need from the documentation. That's not to say that it's the most understandable statement. So the first sentence of the documentation for random.shuffle states that it shuffles the sequence X in place. Now, what's X? So I can see in the notation here that X is a parameter being passed to it. In this case, it would be nums. This bracket notation sort of equals optional in here. So this is basically saying when passed X, which is a sequence, it'll shuffle that in place. What that really translates to is that it's mutating the original object. So when I pass it nums, we're used to things returning something, returning a new list that we capture then in a new variable. In this case, it's a different type of function. This function is mutating or changing the original thing that you're passing it. It's changing it in place. So when I pass it nums, it is acting on nums and not returning anything new. So that's why nums itself got changed. The fact that the new one came in as none is sort of an artifact that by default every function returns a none value. That's maybe something else for a different conversation. So the real solution to the problem of fixing this code is a solution related to deep copying, but that's a Google search and a lecture for another day. So I'm going to summarize a little bit about what we just talked about. When you need to look for something inside of your code, or you're having a problem and you need to search for something to fix it, you have 3 basic steps. First is identify the action statement. So find the statement itself inside your code that seems to have the problem. When you do find that statement, look within it for specifically the function or the verb in question. And this might be your function, like we had random.shuffle, but it might also be the operator, such as less than versus less than or equal to. Second, when you're creating your query, take out all of your local variable names. For example, we searched for just random.shuffle instead of random.shuffle nums. When you leave that variable name in, it really confounds your search results. This wasn't an example of needing to use natural language, but you should always try to use natural language with the correct canonical vocabulary for the language that you're speaking in, the language that you're working in. And it might take you a couple iterative passes to get that language right. And this is also a good case for looking in your documentation to find out, like, oh, what is this thing actually called? Just to help hone in your Google search results. Finally, when you do have some results coming in, you want to identify some appropriate sources. So look at the URLs and get some experience in looking at answers from Stack Overflow versus the documentation. And sometimes you need to go back and forth between the two, because sometimes, particularly for beginners, the documentation, the incredibly formal language is not accessible to absolute beginners, and it is more helpful to go with a more informal tutorial or an answer on Stack Overflow. But always, always bookmark and remember sources that have been helpful to you. And don't be afraid to do multiple searches as needed. Keep going and going and going until you find something that works for you. And if you can't find anything, then feel free to ask. Ask somewhere online. There's a lot of good places. So this is that paper that I referenced in the beginning. It's an excellent paper. It's a pretty easy read. Talking about a lot of the problems that novice programmers have and a lot of the searching strategies that they go with and a lot of the problems that happens in there. If you're an instructor, I highly recommend reading it, and if you're a beginning student, I highly recommend reading it as well, just in the sense that it'll let you know that you are not alone. These are problems that everyone goes through. It takes practice and time and skill to get over, but you'll get there. And the learning curve often ends once you have gotten really good at being able to search and find answers to your questions. So, thanks for listening. And if you find any books or textbooks or Python resources that actually use and talk about searching behaviors, let me know, because I'd love to be able to link them. Thanks.